In 1907, the small town of Stalybridge in England became the setting for what could have been a compelling and intriguing work of fiction. With the scene set and the roles cast, at the centre of it all is a man called George Harry Storrs, the 47-year-old son of a wealthy businessman. George's father, William Storrs, had been the benefactor of many places in Stalybridge, including the local market, swimming hall and the infirmary that would later turn into Tameside Hospital, and George had followed right in his father's footsteps. George owned a mill and was a building contractor, meaning he had many fingers in many pies throughout Stalybridge, and he was the man to go to if you wanted to get something built. With that, and his prestigious mansion, Gorse Hall, he made a rather fine figure, and the locals certainly thought so too, even though they didn't always appreciate his hard nose for business. But George still had many friends in Stalybridge, and one of those friends was the Innes family. At the time, Robert Innes and his wife, Emma, had been on the hunt for a governess for their eldest daughter, and they had just found the perfect match. Maria Hole was a bright young woman with a good background and wonderful references, and the Inneses wasted no time in shipping her out from Bavaria to their home in Stalybridge so she could take charge of their daughter's education immediately. George had already been a regular at the Innes household, but after Maria had moved in, he practically did as well. He would often be seen walking with Maria through the grounds or in the local parks, giving everyone the impression that they were very close. But that, unfortunately for Maria, wasn't the end of their story together. One night in February, Maria put on her cloak, left the Innes household and disappeared, telling no one where she was going or when she planned on coming back, but all became clear only a few weeks later. It had been a harsh winter that year, and many of the town's canals and rivers had frozen over, but Maria was found when they'd finally started to thaw again. She drowned in one of the canals, and no one could quite say whether it had been an accident or if she'd taken her own life. No post-mortem was conducted, but that didn't stop the rumour mill from churning, and plenty of people had many things to say about what they'd thought about what had happened to Maria. Maria was pregnant, at least that's what the rumour said, but that in and of itself didn't explain who the father was. Maria was known to associate with only a few men: Robert Innes, her minister who lived out of town, and George Harry Storrs. Out of these names, there were only one of them that Maria had been seen around town with, and George was named the father of her theoretical baby behind closed doors. Maria had been a staunch Lutheran and had been pregnant out of wedlock, and this would have been something that had been found disgraceful. If she really was with child and George was the father, then it also didn't leave Maria with very many options moving forward. George was already a married man, and Maria wasn't known to be seeing anyone else. Her faith would have kept her from being able to live the life of a mistress, and a rushed wedding with someone she hardly knew would have given away her situation and ruined her reputation. She wouldn't have been able to find work or support herself, and she wouldn't have been able to have used the Innes references, even if she did move to a town and start a new life with her new husband. If Maria really had been pregnant, it's not that far of a stretch to think that she would have taken her own life rather than facing all of the consequences of her ruined reputation as a fallen woman. But the truth is, nobody really knew the truth, now or even at the time. Without an autopsy, there was no way to prove she was pregnant or not, and there was no way to prove her death had been a suicide or an accident. The rumours died down and the town moved on, but that wasn't the end of the bad luck that seemed to follow George around like a dark cloud. In September 1909, George and his wife Maggie went to a friend's house for dinner, but when they were at the dining table, all hell broke loose. Around 9:30 p.m. that evening, everyone sitting in the McDonald's dining room heard someone shouting outside of the window. The man reportedly said, "Hands up or I'll shoot," startling everyone inside the house. Apparently the man didn't wait around either, and he fired a shot, breaking one of the windows and scaring the guests even further, but George actually jumped up and raced towards the window. It was extremely dark outside, so George couldn't see what the man looked like, but he could see the barrel of a gun sticking in through the broken window, and he knew that the man on the other side meant business. According to witnesses, George stared down the man, neither of them moving until George sprang into action again and told everyone that he was going outside to catch him. Maggie begged George to stay, but he didn't listen, instead taking off towards the garden, but by the time he made it there, the man with the gun was already gone. With George's family legacy in Stalybridge, the police were quick to take this incident seriously, and they determined that the man with the gun had been after George, not the McDonald's. The police responded by posting a policeman on George's property and installing a bell on his roof that could be used to alert more officers if they were needed. But even then, George stumbled across someone on his property and he didn't give them a warm welcome. When coming home late one night, George reported spotting an unknown man out in his gardens. Instead of notifying the police, George took it upon himself to teach the man a lesson and to convince him to never trespass on his property again. George beat the intruder, apparently sending him off on his way before George told the police what had happened. But if he told the police first, perhaps the events of this case would have turned out very differently. Because only a few weeks later, on the 1st of November, every available police officer was needed back in town, and that meant that the one on patrol on George's property was taken off duty. It was the day of the elections, but George didn't seem all that concerned to be left alone with his family that night. George and his wife, Maggie, and their niece, Marion Lindley, were all sitting in the dining room waiting for the cook, Mary Evans, to finish making dinner that evening. It was about 2100 hours when Mary heard a sound outside the kitchen door, and she looked up, seeing a man standing right there in the doorway. Mary gasped. She even stopped what she was doing and said, "Oh, Worrell, you frightened me," and then she went right back to finishing dinner. James Worrell was the coachman, but when Mary looked up at him again that night, she realised that this man was taller than Worrell and he had a moustache. But more importantly for Mary in that moment, the man was pointing a gun at her. "Say a word and I'll shoot," he said, but Mary was too frightened to listen. She started screaming and ran back into the house to warn everyone what was going on. Mary had made enough noise to alert the others, and Harry, Maggie, and Marion all jumped up and headed towards the kitchen, with Harry leading the charge. He locked eyes with the intruder, and the two men stared at each other without saying a word for a moment before Harry went for him. The man with the gun didn't shoot it, but perhaps he should have. Harry was a strong man, and he didn't have a hard time taking the intruder on his own, but his wife, Maggie, was also there to help. She raced down the corridor and grabbed a thick wooden walking stick, coming back towards the fighting men and threatening to use it against the intruder, but the intruder shook his head and told her that he wasn't going to use his gun. Maggie grabbed the gun off him, essentially ending the fight, and Harry told her to run upstairs and ring the bell so the police could come and arrest the man. Maggie did what she was told and raced upstairs to ring the bell. Two officers heard it right away, and they also started running towards the house, but by the time that Maggie had made it back downstairs and the officers came bursting into the house, the whole scene had changed again. The fight had happened in the corridor between the kitchen and the dining room, but by the time Maggie had gone back to her husband, he was in the kitchen, lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. He'd been stabbed 15 times with a knife, and the intruder was nowhere to be seen. George unfortunately died of his wounds a little after 2200 hours, turning the investigation from a breaking and entering to a homicide. Witnesses at the scene, including Henry's niece, Marion, claim that the intruder had actually looked a lot like Maggie's nephew, Cornelius Howard, and the police immediately issued a warrant for his arrest, but Cornelius was nowhere to be found, bringing the investigation to a halt before it had even got off the ground. But George's bad luck kept following him even from beyond the grave, and it managed to strike again quickly. His funeral was held on November the 11th, 10 days after his death, and by November 12th, Worrell the coachman was missing. He'd gone out during the day to pick up some things for the household, but he'd never come back, and people were starting to get concerned. A search was launched, and he eventually turned up that evening in a hayloft, hanging from a beam. That was now 2 potential suicides and 1 murder surrounding the Storrs family, and the only suspect was nowhere to be seen. That was until November the 17th, when Cornelius was caught trying to break into a local shop, and the police had their man. Cornelius told them that he'd been at the Ring o' Bells pub on the night that George had been murdered, but the police didn't feel the need to check his alibi. Instead, they put him in a lineup and had the witnesses from that night take a look at it. All 3 of the witnesses picked Cornelius out in the lineup and identified him as the intruder from that night, and that was all the police needed to hear to take Cornelius to the court. But that wasn't all the jury needed to hear to actually sentence him for the murder of his uncle, especially when Cornelius's lawyer, Trevor Lloyd, produced a star witness himself. The police may have not checked up on Cornelius's alibi, but Trevor Lloyd sure did, and when he brought out the owner of the Ring o' Bells pub, he blew the case wide open. The owner of the pub confirmed that Cornelius had been there that night, and the jury took only 30 minutes to find Cornelius not guilty of the charges. Cornelius was a free man, but that also meant that the killer was still out there, and the police were no closer to finding him. That was until June of 1910, almost a full year after the homicide, when a young couple were attacked whilst walking on what had once been George's property. A man wielding a knife sprang at the couple, injuring the young man before running away. But what was most curious about this attack, other than it being on the same property and with the same kind of weapon that had killed George, was that the description of the second man also matched the description of the intruder from the night that George was murdered. The police then believed that the same man had struck again, and they redoubled their efforts to find him. And they did find one man who fit the description, a man named Mark Wilde, an ex-soldier who they charged for the second attack. He was sentenced to 2 months in prison, and the police used this time to build a case against him for the murder of George Storrs, and sure enough, when Mark was released, they took him to a court again. This time their suspect didn't have a solid alibi, and 2 out of the 3 witnesses that night picked him out of a lineup, but almost like some strange twist of fate, Mark Wilde got Trevor Lloyd as his defence lawyer. Trevor Lloyd had been down this road before, and he'd already had one client cleared of the exact same charges. He took one look at the jury and told them that none of the evidence or witness testimonies that the police could provide meant anything, as they'd already tried this once before and got the wrong man on both occasions. The jury agreed, and Mark was cleared of all charges. But that meant that the investigation was now down to 2 suspects, and George's murderer was still on the loose. Maybe it had been Cornelius all along, or maybe it really had been the second suspect, Mark Wilde, or perhaps, if rumours were to be believed, it had nothing to do with either of these men at all. Locals claim to have seen 2 foreign men in town around the time that George was murdered. Travellers, perhaps, or maybe they had another reason to be there and another reason to want to speak with George privately. Maybe they'd come all the way from Bavaria and had a bone to pick over the loss of a sister, and with the man who'd potentially put her in a situation where she felt she had no other choice but to take her own life. Who can say? The police certainly couldn't find anything else either, and this case remains open to this day, no closer to being solved than it was all of those years ago.